Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our study. Now, in today's lecture, Lecture 9, we'll discuss another very important topic in the ancient Chinese government human resource management, and it's how not to lose a great official. Now, previously, we studied how to observe the quality of the officials, right, with the main focus on moral quality. Then we looked at how to attract the virtuous candidates. And after that, we examined the way to use or to utilize virtuous officials. Now, there is still one final piece of the puzzle of human resource management, and that is preserving the virtuous officials. In fact, this is not a new topic. We've mentioned this to some extent when we examine the ways to attract virtuous officials, right? Attracting and preserving are just two sides of the same coin. Likewise, when we were studying the use of virtuous officials, we also mentioned how to preserve the talents. But still, preserving the pool of human resources is like the shortest wooden plank of a barrow. So without it, all of the effort of the previous steps would be of nothing. So having the best employee, is just part of the story. And the employer must treat them in a particular way in order to keep them in the job and achieve governance objectives. And meanwhile, having the talented employees in place, it doesn't automatically lead to proper utilization. So if not properly utilized, it's equally impossible to achieve the governance objectives. Now, how not to lose a great official is, in fact, a major topic in the governing principles of ancient China. And there are many specific discussions and stories about the rationale and the methods of protecting government human resources. So we believe that this part of the teaching is still very necessary. Now, there are 5 major factors that potentially contribute to the loss of great officials. So let's start from the first one. The number one factor is the lack of trust. Okay, lack of trust. Volume 43 of the Governing Principles record a conversation between Guanzi and the Duke Huan of Qi, the state of Qi. In the conversation, Guanzi pointed out 5 obstacles of successful governance. One is that the leader simply cannot distinguish the talented or the virtuous candidates from the unvirtuous ones. And number 2 is that the leader can recognize the virtuous candidates but decide not to use them. 3 is that the leader recruits them into the government but underutilizes them. Number 4 is that the leader uses them but doesn't trust them. And finally, the leader trusts them but allows some morally inferior officials to interfere with their business. So these 5 factors have been recognized to be detrimental to the governance of a country, and distrust is one of them. Now, you may wonder, why would anyone not trust a person if he is, if he has made a recruitment decision in the first place? It makes no sense, right? Well, let's just say, we're not always rational and our minds are not always determined. So this makes people doubt about a previous decision, not necessarily based on new fact, but based on emotion and misinterpretation. The governing principles emphasize that governance should take the realization of human habit and human flaw into consideration. Now, as pointed out, a simple fact, which I think is universally true, that no one in the world is able to please everybody. Isn't that true? I mean, even the most virtuous person is unable to do that. Let's take Confucius as an example. He cultivated himself with the highest standard of ethics and he is the teacher of the whole of Chinese race for 2,500 years. But during his time, on many occasions, he was forced to leave the country by some opposing officials because they feared Confucius' talent and governing ability. So he couldn't please them all. You see, the virtuous people, they have no intention to create confrontation. Well, in fact, most people don't. But they don't work for the sake of self-protection. They work for the greater good. And that may cause some conflict of interest. This is, especially true in the government setting where the action of a virtuous official causes damage to some opposition parties. And the word party here, by the way, is all-inclusive, not just political party, but also any interest group. So the conflict can be anything. For example, perhaps a virtuous official is opposed to unethical behavior of certain government employees, and he may refuse to be corrupted by industrial lobbyists, etc. So all of these will create problems. If we have a look at the flow chart in the PowerPoint, and so starting from the bottom left, starting from the bottom left corner, the green box, when the action of a virtuous official creates some small conflict with some interest groups, they will become discontent with the official. Now, one thing they may do is to complain to the leader or the authority. So this is where the problem comes from. If the leader is able to see the source of conflict, understand the intention of the officials, then there is no issue, and the trust is intact, is maintained. However, if the complaint contains disinformation and the leader is unable to understand the source of the problem, then, and he just so happens to favor the opposition individuals, then it is inevitable that the leader will have growing distrust against the official being complained. Now, we know that trust is the foundation that bonds people together, right? So when distrust emerges, all hell breaks loose. We know that the interpersonal conflict is basically inevitable in an organization, and the difference in opinions among the subordinates are not only normal but valuable actually to the leader, because he can hear different voices and make a more informed decision. However, opinion is only useful when it's not twisted by any personal hatred. So that's why when listening to complaints, the leader must consider the characteristics of the opposition parties. The book of Xin Xu has a chapter that focuses on this particular issue, and it points out that the unvirtuous and incompetent persons are usually jealous of the virtuous and competent ones. They may be jealous of their ability, their reputation, and their power, and they may fear that their existence will become less important and overshadowed in the government and have to give up certain power. So what they will do is to block the employment of the virtuous candidates. Therefore, even if the virtuous officials have been employed by the leader, the unvirtuous officials may do whatever they can to bash the virtuous officials. And this will again create huge disinformation that prevents the leader from giving his full trust. Now, if I ask our viewers, what's the solution to this problem? Well, I guess at this final stage of our course, our viewers will be able to agree with me that the solution lies with the leader. Of course, we can require the officials to be upright in their behavior and, all the complaints must be neutral, but it would be much better if the leader is able to distinguish a genuine complaint from a biased complaint. And this requires the leader to have some wisdom. He must be able to distinguish right from wrong, to discriminate information from disinformation, and must not believe in rumors. So if preserving the virtuous official is the shortest plank, of HR management, then the leader's own wisdom and cultivation is the shortest plank of governance itself. So now let's, we know that distrust is a factor that leads to the loss of talented officials. So what should the government do then? Well, interestingly, Guan Zi illustrated a few best practices, and all of these should be practiced by the leader. He said, when using a virtuous person, do not let the unvirtuous ones discuss about them. Interesting. Let's think about this for a moment. The key about this recommendation is that the leader must be able to recognize the virtuous persons. And this shouldn't prevent useful and necessary monitoring over the virtuous officials, right? It should not. But also, it shouldn't be misused by the unvirtuous officials as a tool to undermine their opponents. Assuming that the identity of the unvirtuous individuals are recognized, right? Assuming that we know who they are, then this recommendation has two functions. First of all, it can prevent the judgment of the leader from being misled or shaken, and thereby maintaining the trust between the leader and the virtuous officials. Now, of course, like I said, if the leader is absolutely clear about who is virtuous and who is not, then it wouldn't be so much of a problem. But this leads to the second function of this particular recommendation, which is to prevent a culture of spreading rumors around the workplace, and also to maintain a positive working atmosphere for the virtuous officials, and indeed for the wider community. The trust is not just between the leader and the officials, but also among the officials themselves. So without trust from the colleagues, the virtuous and talented officials cannot work at their optimal capacity, and they may decide to leave one day. Now, the second best practice says, when using a wise person, do not let the incompetent ones make decision. Okay, so the first practice is about virtuous persons, and the second recommendation is about a wise person. So this is a usual problem at the workplace where, the talented employees have made a good suggestion, but they don't get to make the final call. And if their, suggestions are always blocked by the incompetent decision makers, it won't, it will not only reduce their motivation, but also affect the general performance. And all of these will just give the talented employee one more reason to quit, to leave. The third best practice is, when using a righteous person, do not let the wicked ones doubt him. Now, this is very similar to the first recommendation, and is all about maintaining the upright work atmosphere for the righteous officials and the general working community as a whole. Okay, so these recommendations reflect the common mistakes made by many leaders, unfortunately. So, why should the leaders demonstrate complete trust in the first place then? Right, we're sort of going back. Why should they demonstrate trust? Well, the governing principles show that it is all about reciprocity. Okay, reciprocity. You see, when a virtuous person is trusted and given important tasks to complete, he or she is highly motivated. And a virtuous person understands that trust is not given easily. It stands for enormous risk on the behalf of the leader, doesn't it? So if he cannot complete the task assigned to him at the highest quality, then not only does he feel shameful, but also feel guilty for putting the leader in a bad position. So for this reason, a virtuous person will make a great effort to deliver the result in response to trust. So this is why it is important for the leader to demonstrate complete trust. on the other side of the coin, when a leader shows insufficient trust and doesn't delegate, his official will find it pointless to make an effort, and they will no longer focus on the governance or improve their work, but instead they will focus on how to please the leader. Now, some clever employees may deliberately hide their true potential and abilities so that they won't run the risk of being jealous of by their leaders, or indeed other employees. So we can see that, trust is much more complex than we first thought. And the concept itself is quite easy to comprehend, but it has many consequences which deserve more attention. Now, the second factor of losing the officials is the over-reliance on verification. Now, in the three best practices given by Guanzi previously, one particular common issue that they deal with is the leader's temptation of seeking for a second opinion. Now, the reason is that the leaders are subject to behavior bias, such as undetermined mind and self-doubt, okay, just like everybody else. And it feels as if having a second opinion is always, more prudent than otherwise. And sometimes, even if the leader recognizes the talent of an official, he is undetermined to delegate sufficient authority and power to the official. So in this section, we'll expand on this issue and see what the problem is. Now, as we said before, the leader should avoid allowing the unvirtuous employees to interfere the work of the virtuous ones. And one form of this interference is opinion. Now, for a leader, searching for opinion about a person is a very natural thing to do, and most of the time, the right thing to do. However, the precondition of gathering opinions is that the leader must fully recognize the relative importance between the strength and the weakness of the subject, and do not let the small weaknesses overshadow the strength. Now, here we have an example. There's a person called Ning Qi. Ning Qi was a very talented person during the spring and autumn period. And he was from the state of Wei, but he wanted to work in the government under Duke Huan of Qi. So he wanted to work in a different state. Now, eventually, we have to omit certain details, but eventually he managed to arrange a meeting with the Duke Huan of Qi. And after listening to Ning Qi's about his idea of governance and his vision and plan for 2 whole days, Duke Huan was very impressed and decided to assign an important position to Ning Qi. Now, as one can expect, this received objections from his ministers, and mainly on the ground that Ning Qi was a foreigner from a different state, and some suggested that the Duke should send somebody to the state of Wei to gather some information about Ning Qi and verify his abilities and weaknesses and flaws. Now, the Duke denied the suggestion and said, well, it's almost certain that Ning Qi has some flaws that I wouldn't like. But many leaders mistakenly dismiss the virtuous and talented people for their small mistakes and forego their great strength. Nobody is perfect, and I will only use his talent. Now, let's pause for a moment and give it some thought. Remember in lecture 6, I think, we spent a lot of time on the 8 observations of officials' quality, right? And we said that these are extremely important to the functioning of the government. But the Duke seemed to refuse the performance quality check. So does this mean that the Duke was wrong? Or perhaps the quality check is not important? Well, first of all, the Duke must have made some observations about Ning Qi during their 2-day meetings. That's for sure. And secondly, there's a trade-off to be made. You see, at that time, every independent state in the land of China was competing with each other at all fronts: military power, economics, and human resources. So all the great leaders understood that obtaining the virtuous and talented officials was the most effective way to success. However, these people came in short supply, right? And the utility of human resource must be targeted. So the fact that, you see, Duke Huan had to employ someone from a foreign state obviously shows the shortage of domestic supply of talent. And the Duke must, prioritize what is most important and what is most needed by the government and indeed the country. So by doing so, the Duke also required all the officials to focus on the big picture and not to be bogged down by the minor issues. And this is especially important when the government or any organization for that matter employs an outsider, because the outsider may be marginalized by the insiders for distrust. So the Duke was therefore promoting an atmosphere of collaboration and trust among all the officials. Now, about this, Yan Zi made a very compelling argument about why it is inappropriate for the government to ask for the perfect officials, right? He said that using people is like growing vegetation. And different types of soil and land are suitable to grow certain vegetations. So it is illogical to expect all the lands to produce the same vegetation up to the same quality and standard. Likewise, people are different in their abilities and talents, and they will most likely perform very differently if they are assigned the same task. But the common mistake made by many leaders is that they ask for all-round perfection in an official. But because nobody is perfect, they're bound to be disappointed. And what is more, if the leaders allow themselves to be surrounded by treacherous ministers who condemn the good ministers for their imperfection, then the leaders may dismiss the good officials by mistake. The bottom line of recruitment is that the candidates must demonstrate sufficient degree of benevolence and righteousness. And if they do, then the leaders should tolerate their imperfection. Now, if our viewers are still not convinced about the necessity of tolerating imperfection, let's think about a diamond, or a gem, or a very expensive jade, if you like. In the real world, there's actually no such thing as a completely 100% flawless diamond. It's all relativity. The definition of a flawless diamond is one that has no inclusions that are visible under a 10 times magnification. Because diamonds are, formed in nature under turbulent conditions of extreme heat and pressure, diamonds cannot be 100% pure. It's impossible. So when using, if you use more powerful magnification, such as 60 times or 100 times, a flawless diamond may actually present visible blemishes. But we still assign great value to diamonds. We treasure them because they come in short supply, and small blemishes do not affect the overall value. But the common mistake made by many people when reviewing a person is that they tend to breeze through the major contributions very quickly, but are overly picky about the small mistakes. Now, if you ask why would anybody act like this, well, perhaps it's because picking on other people makes a person feel pretty smart about himself or herself. But the danger is that it plants the seed of losing the talented candidate in the future. Now, a related problem is what is called the inappropriate ability review of an official. Okay, so that's the third problem. Now, this is a slightly different problem from the over-reliance on verification problem and the all-round perfection problem mentioned earlier. The inappropriate ability review problem means that the review is simply inaccurate, and And this is also another way to lose a talented official. According to Guanzi, the ability review must be based on trial and testing and cannot rely solely on promises. For example, he said, those who claim to be brave test by letting them lead a military troop. Those who claim to be wise test by letting them managing government business. So recruitment is then based on their performance. Now, although this is quite a simple recommendation, no doubt, but one important note when reviewing the ability of an official is to bear in mind that no one is perfect. So this means that the reviewer must be able to pinpoint the official's comparative advantage, comparative advantage, and then maximize the utility of talent by assigning specific tasks and responsibilities accordingly. Volume 48 of the Governing Principles illustrate this point by comparing the unique features between a horse and a cattle. Now, it points out that horses are able to travel long distance, but cannot plow the field. But cattle, on the other hand, can plow the field quite easily, but cannot travel long distance. And this conclusion was made based on observation. We didn't know that before. We didn't know that to begin with, right? This is made on based on observation and testing a long time ago. And human beings have been utilizing the comparative advantages of these two types of animals very well based on such understanding. And nobody would complain about a horse not being able to plow the field, right? And vice versa for the cattle. So the use of human resources should follow the same principle, and it should start from an appropriate ability review. Now, we know that this recommendation can be easily applied to evaluate an official's skills and qualification. That's easy. But this also applies to reviewing an official's virtue. Virtue is not at all a vague concept, right? It's not a vague concept, but it is concrete, visible, and verifiable through observations and testing. In traditional Chinese culture, the level of position and responsibility of an official must be linked to the level of his virtue and moral standard. Because of the uniqueness of the government officials, the higher the position, the more influential he or she will be over the entire population. And this not only includes functional influence, but also moral influence. Therefore, it is necessary for the government to perform ethics review on the officials based on past conduct and testing. Well, in fact, the mismatch between position and virtue is another reason of losing the talented officials. Okay, so I think this warrants a separate section. In volume 32 of the Governing Principles, Guanzi pointed out 3 problems that government leaders should be mindful about. One is that the government official's moral conduct is not suitable for his current rank and position. That's the first one. And 2 is that the official's contribution is not reflected correctly by his remuneration and salary. And 3 is that the official's ability is not reflected by his current position. So it's not difficult to imagine the consequence of these issues, right? Which is the officials with virtue and skills will feel distrusted and may decide to leave the government. And what is left is a group of incapable officials, and social disorder is only a matter of time, really. Sometimes, because of the administrative rigidity, the position-virtue mismatch is inevitable. The Governing Principles recognize this reality and provide a trade-off. So basically, there are 2 potential scenarios. Okay, one is where a virtuous man being placed in a low and insignificant position, and the other is where an unvirtuous man being placed in a senior and influential position. So if we have to choose one from the two scenarios, then we would rather choose the first one instead of the second one. Although placing a virtuous man in a low position results in enormous waste of human resource, a virtuous man wouldn't take action against the leader or the government. He may not be happy about it, but the most he would do is to leave the government so as to show his discontent and disappointment. However, an unvirtuous person with great power will most definitely cause far more damage to the well-being of the country. He may use his power to further self-interest at the expense of the public. So this should be avoided with great effort. Now, you may ask, why would the government put an unvirtuous person in an important position in the first place? Well, apart from the obvious failure of observation and quality check, this may also be the result of personal connection, which means that the leaders, recruit based on personal connection rather than virtue. Now, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, personal connection itself shouldn't stop the leader from recruiting a suitable candidate, right? It should not. But when the connected candidate is unvirtuous, compared with the simple observational failure, this has a worse impact on the rest of the workforce. Now, a simple observation failure can be a relatively simple fix, okay? But recruiting unvirtuous official based on personal connection will destroy people's confidence in the government's integrity, and the true able people will decide to leave. So that's why this is an even bigger problem than observational failure. So this leads to our next section on the social impact of position-virtue mismatch. Now, we must understand that the leader of a government is not just, an ordinary public servant. He's special. He's special not because he's paid more, but because everything that he does sends a signal. Now, the top-level recruitment policy also sends a signal, not only to the rest of the government body, but to the general public as well. This is illustrated in volume 50 of the Governing Principle. It says that when the government awards a high position to officials based on their virtue and ability, the public will view virtue and ability as more important than position. This is because they know that virtue and ability are the causes and position is the result. This is true even if the candidate has close connection with the leader, because their ability and virtue will be visible to the public, right? They can see it. And in turn, the public will focus more on self-cultivation and improve their trustworthiness and propriety. I think this is very easy to understand. Now, as a university lecturer in financial studies, I can tell our viewers that the point of focus of the students changes every few years. I remember 15 years ago, students who wanted to work in the financial industry simply had to choose a finance degree because the industry recruiters recognize these degrees. Now the industry classification has become much more complex and specialized, and there are special qualifications for almost every major areas of accounting and finance work. So for this reason, students these days focus more on the professional qualifications that are, offered by universities, and they are very motivated to obtain one. And this is ultimately driven by the demand of the industry recruiters. The demand for virtue follows the same mechanism. You see, if recruitment is based on virtue, it will be less likely for the candidate to cheat in securing an official position. Of course, we can't rule out the possibility of a few bad apples, but the general atmosphere of government work and job application is more ethics-focused, thereby reducing the overall tendency of cheating. On the other hand, if the recruitment is not based on virtue, or ability, then it will not be very long before the public losing the incentive of self-cultivation. And instead, they will only respect the rich and the powerful. For the official candidates, because virtue doesn't necessarily get them a job, they may switch to a more effective way of getting a job, such as bribery or blocking the virtuous people. Of course, in the previous scenario where recruitment is based on virtue, people in general may also respect the rich and the powerful. But that's fine, because wealth and power is related to the ethics and morality of the person. Now, if we look at some of the prosperous periods in ancient Chinese history, with great social advancement, people could usually judge a person's virtue and morality based on his wealth and position. They could. People would show respect to this person because they knew that this person had earned the title through his superiority in virtue. Now, this is very meaningful to social governance because through the motivation of improving living standard, people are encouraged to self-cultivate. However, if we look at the periods of social chaos, there is a clear disconnection between wealth and ethics. Now, during these periods, people would only focus on wealth, and without the constraint of ethics and morality, people would do anything to get rich and sacrifice anybody to gain power. Of course, this is not rocket science, and is difficult to implement this virtue position match for every single post in the government. However, it is important for the government to set the general tone for the public through the recruitment of senior positions. Now, because we only want to recruit the virtuous people, do we have to worry about their professional ability? In other words, is it possible that the government is limiting its pool of potential human resource by only recruiting the virtuous? Well, first of all, this is a false proposition because both virtue and skills are acquired through education. So there is no such thing as, that the recruitment of virtue limits the pool of talent. Secondly, let's think about it this way. Which of the two persons would you rather get married with? All right, let's think about marriage. Two persons. Someone who is extremely smart and good looking, but vicious, plotting to trick you and cheat on you every now and then. Or someone with mediocre intelligence and look, but is kind, considerate, and loyal to your love. Well, I venture to say that it is an easy choice, especially for those who have had some unpleasant experiences. That's not a hard decision to make. Now, of course, virtue position matching is easier said than done, and the success of it is based on certain conditions. So, to understand that, let's have a look at a short story. You may remember this person, Zhao Jianzi, right, from the previous lecture. And Zhao Jianzi was the head of the noble family during the spring and autumn period. So one day, Zhao Jianzi asked one of his officers, Xie Hu, and he asked him about a potential candidate for governor post. So without hesitation, Xie Hu recommended a person called Xing Bo Liu. Xing Bo Liu. But in fact, Xie Hu and Xing Bo Liu, they were enemies. Well, they didn't like each other anyway. So Zhao Jianzi asked, why would you recommend someone you hate so much for a high position? And Xie Hu replied, well, recommendation shouldn't exclude enemies, and dismissal shouldn't exclude close acquaintances. Xie Hu recognized Xing Bo Liu's superiority of moral standard, so he made this recommendation. Right? Now, upon hearing this, Xing Bo Liu came to express his appreciation to Xie Hu. But Xie Hu said, look, I recommended you because you are the best for this job, but I still resent you for what happened between us. Now please leave. So, although we're not recommending hatred or resentment, we can say that Xie Hu still managed to do the impossible. And that is complete sense of justice and pure heart for the public interest. And he didn't let the personal affair interfere with the public affair. So this allowed Xie Hu to evaluate a candidate's competency in a neutral and fair manner. So the purpose that we tell the story is to re-emphasize the fact that nobody is perfect. And a neutral evaluation is the key to successful human resource management. So as compared to, evaluating skills and qualifications, evaluating virtue is more difficult and more easily influenced by personal impression. This is because skills and qualifications are more visible and concrete. There's a piece of paper. Even if we resent somebody, as long as this person has the right certificate and training experience, we can still tick the box quite easily. But the interpretation of virtue requires more understanding about the candidate, and it is more personal. The more personal it becomes, the more easily the judgment gets influenced by personal bias. So that's why the precondition of virtue-based selection and utility is a strong sense of justice. Now, we mentioned earlier that a close relation should not prevent a virtuous candidate from being recruited, just because of the potential conflict of interest. This is because the recruiter may be missing out the really good candidates. Now, the key of success of human resource management is not about the relationship or non-relationship. It's about the sense of justice and high morality. And furthermore, having a close relationship with the candidate may also enable a detailed and accurate assessment about the candidate. So we shouldn't rule out this possibility bluntly. Now, another point of caution about virtue position matching is being vigilant about promises and speech making. Now, this topic has been discussed in multiple chapters in the governing principles, just because, it is one of the most common mistakes made by the leaders when dealing with human resource management. The iron rule is that the ability of speech making can never, ever be used as an indicator of virtue. I know I have, repeated myself about this issue throughout this course, and I assure you that I am not forgetful. It is intentional. As compared to speech-making skills, the cultivation of good virtue is a much more time-consuming activity. But it is obvious that the virtue is more important than speeches in country governance. Although almost everybody understands this, speech is more easily recognized than virtue, right? It's visible. So for impatient people, they're more likely to make a recruitment decision based on speeches. And when that happens, there is no way to guarantee a virtue position match, and will run the risk of losing the virtuous officials. Now we come to the final factor of losing the talented official, and it's called competing with the people. Competing with the people. Now, this is a peculiar factor. It doesn't mean that the government lose the physical person, but it means that the government lose the heart of the person. More specifically, it means that the official no longer has the incentive to serve the public interest, but only to serve himself. And this is, basically equivalent to losing a talented official. In traditional Chinese culture, and indeed the governing principles, there is one important principle followed by all the good officials, namely the principle of exclusivity. Now, it means that the government official should be excluded from the business of profit and be content with their government salary. And more specifically, government officials are not allowed to enter into the business world that potentially competes with the people. Now, let me explain this principle in more details. So the purpose of this principle of exclusivity is to promote fairness. Okay, to promote fairness. But let's define fairness first, right? Well, what is it? Well, the governing principles use animals as a metaphor. It says that those animals which are given sharp teeth do not have sharp horn, like lions and tigers. Those animals which are given strong wings have only 2 legs, like eagles, right? So this follows the principle that when someone has enjoyed some big advantages, he should not pursue the small benefits. Now the same goes to public officials. When someone already enjoys the government salary, he should not receive more benefit through business or gainful occupations in general, or competing with the people. So if he wants to do business, then he should quit the government job and do business, but he cannot do both. The question is that, is this principle motivated by the fact that aristocracy already allowed the officials to hold their offices by hereditary right? Well, the answer is no. First of all, Confucianism doesn't allow for aristocracy. Apart from the emperor's immediate descendants, no one could inherit their father's official position in the government. Secondly, this principle applies to all staff working in the government, even for those in the most peripheral office and low-level function. This is because the abuse of power can take place at all levels. During Confucius' time, feudal lords and noble families enjoy political power and own the capitals. So if they engage in businesses and compete with the people in the economic field, the people will lose its foothold. But let's not confuse this with the so-called state-owned enterprise. It's a completely different issue. State-owned enterprise is the function of allocation of resources, and it plays by the market rule. And what we're talking about here is the government officials use their connections and power to gain economic benefit at the expense of the people. So when this happens, then there is no difference from losing the officials in the first place. Now, this principle is not only philosophically sound, but also has practical implication in guiding the governance policy. The governing principles argue that the government officials and the common people should have different responsibilities and purposes of work. The main purpose of a government official is to pursue the highest standard of ethics and justice. And his highest career goal is to influence the people through his virtue. If his influence is limited or misdirected, it's not the end of the day, but he should strive to self-cultivate and make correction to his behavior. So this should be in the mind of government officials days and nights. But for the common people or people outside of the public service, their main responsibility is to make a good living through gainful activities in order to support their families. Now, of course, this is not to say that people should disregard ethics in their work, but as compared to the government official, it is completely legitimate for a common person to focus on making money. Therefore, this goal of the job, which is ethics, should be made very clear in the government recruitment policy. So when we say the government doesn't lose a talented official, it really means that the official can set his mind on the well-being of the people and doesn't compete with the people. The realization of this goal depends on the implementation of some of the HR policies that we studied before, and we can talk about 2 policies here. One is that the government official should be properly remunerated. Okay, we mentioned this in the lecture of attracting the talented officials. A proper level of remuneration can give the officials assurance of a stable life and allowed them to focus more on personal development. A related HR policy is officials' education. And I think the book of the governing principles would be a good start, wouldn't you say? But how can the officials know about their goals and missions as a public servant? Well, there's no reason to expect them to know it. I mean, why would anybody know it, right? So people must be reminded and educated. And this is beyond university degrees and formal education. Now, the exclusivity from profit-taking by the government official has a far greater meaning to the country. As Mencius pointed out to the King Hui of Liang, if all the government officials focus on personal profit and disregard the moral influence on the people, everyone in the country will become narrow-minded and rob from each other. From top to bottom, money become the only purpose of life and the only benchmark of success, the only condition of love, the only motivation of friendship, and the only meaning of being a person. So in summary, the principle of exclusivity of government officials from gainful activity really has a profound meaning to governance, and it starts with proper official remuneration enhanced by ethical education and ends with an elevation of the overall ethical standard of the nation. This concludes Lecture 9. Thank you.